Hello, this is lecture 7, and this is a thematic lecture on the topic of slavery in colonial America. So, what we're going to do today is explain how it becomes entrenched in colonial American, North American society. Why does it become such an important labor source for North America? But to do that, we're going to kind of trace how that happens, and we're going to start out with the idea of slavery prior to the 1660s. So, prior to the 1660s, it was different than the type of slavery that will emerge in the 1690s and later. And it's going to be very different from the slavery that will be in place probably from the more well-known era of right around the Civil War, where there is a lot of enslaved labor um, extracting cotton wealth from the American South. So, it's a system that evolves and changes over time. And I want to make sure that we're well aware of that it is an evolving institution in North America, what will eventually become the United States. So slavery prior to the 1660s looked very different than it eventually will. During this time, there were some advancement opportunities. Things were a lot less rigid, social hierarchy, racial hierarchies, racial distinctions were a lot less rigid. There were a lot more chances for people with a background coming from Africa. They had and one of the most, I think, telling stories of this, what I mean when I'm talking about advancement opportunities, is the story of Anthony Johnson, who's pictured here with his wife, Mary. Anthony Johnson was from Africa. He was enslaved, and then he was transported to North America, where he worked on a tobacco farm. He was successful enough that he was able to buy his own freedom, and then he bought his own tobacco farm and bought his own slaves and ran his own plantation and became very wealthy. There were more chances to do that because the enslaved population was low enough where they were not seen as a threat to the white majority, so they were able to do things like this. There were more advancement opportunities like this to make money and to change one's status from enslavement to freedom. And at this time as well, if you were free, if you were black in America and were free, like you had bought your own freedom or somebody had freed you, you had a lot more social advancement opportunities as well. If you were free, you were free to marry, you were free to marry anybody. You were free to testify in court. You could vote, you could buy land like Anthony Johnson did. So there was a lot less rigidity in racial divisions prior to the 1660s. It's going to be by 1662 when tobacco farming becomes really lucrative and there's more need for labor and labor kept in that position of laboring on tobacco farms, that there'll be more restrictive laws based on race, where there'll be restrictions to marriage and restrictions to opportunities to own land. So, quiz question number 1, who was Anthony Johnson? The big thing that's going to really change this, I hinted at it in the last slide. The real thing that's going to change that more loose racial hierarchy, that sort of racial classification and distinction in North America, is going to be something known as Bacon's Rebellion. This is really what's going to cause a very dramatic shift in attitudes towards African slavery in the continent. And I want to explain why this is the case. This is extremely important. Understanding Bacon's Rebellion is a big key takeaway from early U.S. history and this lecture in general. Um, Understanding why this leads to more enslaved labor in North America is paramount. But how does this Bacon's Rebellion start? And then we'll kind of explain what it has to do with slavery. Bacon's Rebellion begins in 1676 with the Virginia governor, William Berkeley, who's pictured to the right here, giving away all of the best tobacco lands to all of his wealthy followers. So he played favorites. He had a lot of favoritism, and there was a finite amount of land, and Berkeley was giving it away to people that he liked, people that supported him politically. And it became a problem because he refused to take more indigenous land and make it available to other English settlers there. He didn't want to cause trouble with the indigenous population. He actually had a very lucrative deerskin trade going with them. He didn't want to jeopardize that. So he said, nope, there's only a certain amount of land. I've given it away to my wealthy friends. That's it. Sorry, everybody else, you don't get land. The problem is there's a lot of people that really want land, and a lot of individuals there that feel very entitled to land in the Virginia area because many of them were indentured servants. You remember, the indentured servant was someone who traded 5 to 7 years of their life and work for passage to America with the idea that once that 5 to 7 years was up, they would be free and they would get some land, and then they could do whatever they wanted with it. They could grow wealthy and powerful if they were able to do so. So now you have a lot of people who have come over with the promise that when your time is done, when your time is up and your work is finished, you will get some land. And guess what? There's no land because Berkeley has given it all away. So you have a lot of very angry people wondering where the land they were promised is, and they're not getting it. So these landless, freed indentured servants who have served out their indenture are extremely upset by this. And they find a leader in a wealthy landowner named Nathaniel Bacon. Nathaniel Bacon hates Berkeley. He doesn't like the whole favoritism cronies thing Berkeley's got going on, and he thinks that it's time to get rid of Berkeley and take land, take more indigenous land, and hand it out to the freed indentured servants who have been promised that land. So, quiz question number two before we continue on to Bacon's Rebellion. Quiz question number two is what caused Bacon's Rebellion? So the rebellion of the freed servants who want land, they're very angry. They're led by Nathaniel Bacon. They want the land they've been promised. They rebel against Governor Berkeley. They end up marching on Jamestown and burn it to the ground. This is a artistic rendition of that. Um, but Bacon and his followers burn the town down. Berkeley is forced to flee because he is the seen as the great villain in all of this. And Bacon becomes kind of the new leader of Jamestown. He and his followers, the landless freed servants that he's gathered in a quest for more land. They end up plundering anything that's left. They plunder Berkeley's estate. They try to kill his supporters. It gets extremely violent. Bacon's rebellion, this conflict motivated by a desire for land, gets extremely violent. And the only thing that ends the rebellion is that eventually England gets word that this is happening over in Jamestown, and they send troops over, and English warships have to restore order in Jamestown. It gets that violent there. Nathaniel Bacon dies before he could be put on trial for staging this rebellion against Governor Berkeley, but 23 of his supporters are hanged for this, for the rebellion, for participating in it. Understandably so. The English government and a lot of other people just observing this are pretty frightened by what's gone on. They don't like the fact that indentured servants are so volatile, and they start to be seen as very much a liability. This is the important thing to take away from Bacon's Rebellion. It's caused by lack of availability of land for indentured servants, and this is when there is a shift towards more enslaved labor. Because enslaved labor is seen as less volatile. Why? Because if you are enslaved for life. You are not promised land, you are promised nothing. Your term does not end. You don't have to be given land. It's seen as less of an issue because indentured servants are causing too much trouble. There's too many of them. They all need land. They only work for 5 to 7 years, and then you have more and more and more and more and more. There's just not enough land to be given out in exchange for labor. If the only labor source you have is indentured servants, you don't have enough land to meet that requirement. So enslaved labor is seen as the better alternative because there's so much demand for labor. There's so much tobacco being grown. They need so much labor to harvest it and process it and ship it that it's seen as the best option. Enslaved labor is for life, and you don't need to give them land afterwards. So it meets the need of the Jamestown settlers of the English in Virginia. You have a long-term labor source that will never cause something like a Bacon's Rebellion to happen because they are not going to be after any land that was promised to them. They're not promised any land. This is a key pivotal moment in American history because it is when specifically the American South starts to entrench enslaved labor because they have seen indentured servant labor as unreliable and unsustainable now that there wasn't enough land and it's just not enough labor either. There's just not enough people willing or able to become indentured servants to meet the labor needs for growing tobacco in Jamestown and Virginia. Okay, quiz question number 3. Why did Bacon's Rebellion lead to a shift towards more enslaved labor? And as an aside to this too as well, people are just scared of indentured servants now. Like they're thinking you have these people that are going to be a ticking time bomb. Eventually, if they don't get their land, this is what's going to happen. They're English. They have English background as well. They might have supporters like Nathaniel Bacon who agree with them. People get a little nervous about indentured servants after Bacon's Rebellion. So Bacon's Rebellion is that catalyst for a shift towards more slave labor. And now, as I mentioned, this was a part of entrenchment of slavery in North America. This is when, I guess, demographically, I don't know what the right category is for this. This is when North American colonies, some of them, specifically the southern colonies, like Virginia, shift from being considered societies with slaves to slave societies. Let me unpack that for you. There are classifications that certain anthropologists and historians use to determine what role slavery plays in the society. After Bacon's Rebellion, after indentured servants are proven to be too volatile and unreliable, and slavery becomes entrenched, there is a shift from society, specifically in places like Virginia, from less to more reliance on enslaved labor. Places like Virginia go from being societies with slaves to slave societies. And I'll give another rundown of a definition for this too. A society with slaves is one where there are enslaved individuals within that society, but they are not vital to the economy. If they are taken away, if their labor source is removed, the economy is not going to collapse. They're not so important that things can't go on without them. They're there. Their labor is being used, but the economy doesn't hinge on the product of enslaved labor. A slave society is different. That is a society where enslaved labor is paramount. You need it for whatever the economy is producing. The tobacco economy in Virginia it becomes a slave society. If it was not for enslaved labor, many people feared that the tobacco economy would collapse. They needed, required, relied on enslaved labor to make a profit. They needed it. That society depended on enslavement. And it very much was tobacco growth that required enslaved labor in that. So we can see post Bacon's Rebellion, they still have a lot of tobacco they want to grow. They need labor. Indentured servants are out. Where are they going to turn to? They're going to turn to enslaved Africans. And society in Virginia shifts from a society with slaves to a slave society. And it's also evident in numbers. The enslaved population will grow pretty strongly from being about 10% of the population in the late 1600s to about half of the population by 1750. So that's a pretty steep increase in enslavement in that area. Okay, quiz question number 4. What is the difference between a society with slaves and a slave society? So I mentioned that now is when there is an entrenchment of slavery in North America, that there are more. This is not something that is brand new for North America. What's going to happen is North American colonists, Virginia tobacco planters, are going to tap into the already existing Atlantic slave trade. They don't invent it for this, for tobacco growth. They tap into this system that's been in place for hundreds of years by this point. Started in the 1490s with the sugar trade and the demand, that growth and demand for labor for sugar plantations. So the Atlantic slave trade is an already established entity. Now, more enslaved Africans are being diverted to North America to meet the demand for tobacco labor. During this time, about roughly 10 million Africans will be transported to North and South America by 1820. A vast majority of them are still being sent to sugar and other plantations in Caribbean and South America. A very small amount, a very small percentage are actually being sent to North America overall to grow tobacco, but more than there had been in the past. And part of the Atlantic slave trade that's always important to keep in mind is that African nations themselves participated in it. A lot of them were participatory in the slave trade. Many of them participated in the capture of individuals to be sold into enslavement. A lot of this was done with kind of a very short-sighted profit profit generated motivation here. Um, the African nations would be extremely destabilized by this because the ideal individual for enslavement is someone who is young and strong. And when you siphon all of the young, strong people out of your society, it's going to weaken. So, although short term, some African nations did, and specifically elite leaders, benefited from making some quick money off of this, overall, it would prove extremely detrimental to almost every single nation in the continent. Once those individuals were enslaved in Africa and sent with the destination of one of the Americas, the individuals who were uh, captured and sent across the Atlantic had to go through something known as the Middle Passage. And the Middle Passage was the middle leg of the journey. Think of the first leg of the journey was capture and initial enslavement in Africa. The Middle Passage is that journey across the Atlantic Ocean. The end of the journey is the arrival in maybe a tobacco plantation in Virginia or perhaps a sugar plantation in Brazil. So the Middle Passage was the middle leg of the journey. And this part of the slave trade was the reason I even talk about it and put it here, is because it really was the most inhumane and excruciating of the slave trade. In order to maximize profit, slave traders would pack people as tight as physically possible onto ships. That's what's pictured here. The idea was is that yes, people will die from malnourishment and mistreatment on here, but you still made more money by tight packing than you did by allowing people to move freely. So a lot of this horrible treatment was with the idea of maximizing profits, packing people as tightly as possible. Um, there would lead to, of course, disease could spread fairly quickly. It's extremely painful. It's extremely uncomfortable. It's a very long trip. There's no engine on the boats in this time period. You're sailing across the Atlantic. It could be up to a 3 month journey, like this. Of course, people were they were allowed to move a little bit and given some exercise to try to keep them in good shape for when they arrived at their destination, but it's still an extremely inhumane thing to do. It's still an extremely difficult thing to imagine experiencing. The Middle Passage was seen as the most deadly and cruel part of the journey. I mentioned earlier too about how disease could spread. There are stories of huge disease outbreaks leading to slave traders having to cut their losses. They would throw everybody overboard and they would just drown because they realized the disease is spreading so quickly. There was nothing they could do. They just had to throw everybody overboard and and go back and try again. Lots of very horrific stories emerge out of this. Too, stories about how when people would die on board these slave ships, they would be thrown overboard. And sharks were rumored to always follow slave trading ships because they knew that there would be bodies being thrown overboard at fairly regular intervals. Okay. Quiz question number 5. What was the Middle Passage? So this is, I want to talk a little bit about, we have the first leg of the journey, enslavement in Africa. Then you have the Middle Passage, and then the end is the arrival in the Americas. So the destination might have been tobacco, growing tobacco in Virginia. A lot of labor needed there. Specifically, now there's, nobody wants to use an indentured servant. But another destination for enslaved labor was the Carolinas. And the Carolinas were slightly different from Virginia. They were more about growing rice. And I want to talk briefly about what's going on here in the Carolinas, North and South Carolina. One of the things, and this too also has kind of an interesting evolution of how slavery becomes entrenched in this region as well. It really kind of starts more in the 1700s, specifically 17 teens, with an event known as the Yamasee War. And the Yamasee War was an event where there was a conflict between European settlers and the indigenous Yamasee people. The Europeans ended up killing a majority of the Yamasee, and by doing so, they ended up killing off a lot of the Yamasee that they had been enslaving and using for their labor. So the Yamasee War left that indigenous population very decimated, and therefore the Europeans were no longer able to enslave them. So that was their catalyst in the Carolinas for now needing a new labor source. They're going to turn to enslaved Africans. They're going to tap into the Atlantic slave trade post Yamasee War. When enslaved Africans are brought to the Carolinas, they bring with them the knowledge of rice cultivation, and rice production really takes off in this region. It becomes the primary crop, more so than tobacco. It becomes rice in the Carolinas. And because of this, slavery in the Carolinas is different from the Chesapeake, different from Maryland and Virginia, where tobacco is paramount. So, some of the differences here, I just want to outline. Obviously, some of the differences are, of course, different crops being grown. It's rice in the Carolinas. But another difference from Chesapeake slavery, another way that slavery in the Carolinas is different, is because of that rice cultivation. Rice has a different agricultural rhythm than tobacco. It's less intensive year round. Tobacco is like intensive all the time. Rice has a couple lulls in its cultivation when it's growing and when the and certain times during the year. That ends up allowing the enslaved individuals in the Carolinas to develop a bit more autonomy. They're able to have more downtime, more personal time, where they're able to grow some of their own food and maintain some cultural practices as well. They're It's in the Carolinas that historians have noted that there is a more retention, more ability to retain African traditions, more retention of African language, religion, cultural practices, styles of dress, partially because they do have more lulls in the laboring season, the growing and harvesting season, but also because a lot of Europeans relied on this African knowledge of rice cultivation to be successful. So the Africans in the Carolinas had a bit more power, a bit more autonomy, a bit more leverage to extract slightly better treatment. So, quiz question number 6. How was slavery in the Carolinas different from slavery in the Chesapeake? Moving around to other colonies in the American South, other English colonies. One of them that we haven't talked about yet was Georgia. Georgia was founded in 1762 by a elite noble known as James Oglethorpe. And James Oglethorpe wanted Georgia to be his own colony. It was kind of given to him by the crown to do his own thing with. And he envisioned it as a haven for the worthy poor. It was going to be a place where poor but noble, poor but good moral people in England could go in and have a fresh start in life. They could reinvent themselves, especially if they were in debt, they'd fallen on hard times. It was seen as a fresh start for people. And because of that, Oglethorpe, when he's given the colony of Georgia, says no slavery is allowed there. Georgia is only a place where men can rebuild themselves. He wanted it to be a place where they could start over, where if you were poor, but you still were of good moral character, you could start over. You could work yourself, work up from the bottom. You could start a farm and fix your situation there. You'd found yourself impoverished in England. You need a fresh start. Here you go. So Oglethorpe does not want slavery there because he thinks that that's going to be something that's just corruption. He thinks that slavery is corrupt. He doesn't want to see it in place. And he thinks that it's going to take away opportunities from the worthy white poor that he wants to see thrive on their own. He doesn't want to see this society ruined by slavery. However, Oglethorpe's vision is doesn't really pan out. A lot of the settlers in Georgia want to become wealthy by using enslaved labor to grow rice and tobacco, and he's kind of quickly voted out, really. His opinion is pushed aside. He's not able to control the entirety of everywhere in Georgia, and slavery does become a labor source present in there, despite Oglethorpe's wishes to keep it out, to keep it morally pure, and to keep it this pristine opportunity for poor white settlers from England to have a fresh start in life. Quiz question number 7. Why did Georgia initially ban slavery? And I say initially too, because as I mentioned, it only works for a little while. They try, and then the demand is so great to become wealthy from enslaved labor that it doesn't work. Plus, there's enslavement almost everywhere north of Georgia. It's very hard to keep it out. Looking to the North is not a place where slavery is absent. The North is definitely going to be a society with slaves, but it is not a slave society. There is enslaved labor being used in the North, but it's not vital to the economy. In the North, there will be enslaved Africans working on small farms. Some of them, if they're skilled, like they know how to make shoes or barrels, they'll be put to work in a shoemaking store or a cooperage. And a lot of them are their labor is being used at dockyards, so loading and unloading ships. There's a lot of harbors up in the New England, New York area, New York Harbor. So slavery is present there, but it's in very small amounts. It's not vital to the economy. I just want to make you aware of that it's seen as that it starts to become seen as a Southern thing, but there is slavery present in the North as well. And part of it is because there are quite a bit of slave markets. New York City is a real hotspot for slave trading. A lot of enslaved individuals who will eventually end up in the South first arrive in North America in New York City, in one of the large slave markets in around what's kind of now Manhattan in that area. But while slavery is present in the North, it's very different. It's not as vital to the economy. It's not in quite the same numbers. And those individuals who are enslaved are doing other things. The North is too cold for tobacco, too cold for large plantations. So their labor is being used for some of these other things that are on the slide and that I mentioned, you know, dockyard work, some very light smaller agricultural work, or skilled artisan labor. Okay, this was quiz question number 8, I believe. Uh, quiz question number 8. How was slavery different in colonies in the North? Staying on with the North, that doesn't mean that the North, just because it was a society with slaves and that wasn't as vital to the economy, it doesn't mean that the North was immune to insurrection or social instability and uprisings from enslaved individuals. I mentioned that New York City and New York Harbor was a extremely well-trafficked area of slave trade, to that effect that it made the people who lived there and politicians there it made them concerned enough about an enslaved population that in 1702, the New York State government enacts something known as the New York Slave Codes. And what that does is because it's such a trading hub and there are so many enslaved individuals coming and going from there, they enact these codes to restrict liberty to anybody who is enslaved. Um, they do things like they make it so that you can't testify in court. If you're enslaved, they add things in like that to restrict that liberty. Um, Another thing that happens in New York is that in 1711, there is another slave market opened on what is now Wall Street. It still was Wall Street then too. It's been Wall Street for a while. But in 1711, another big market is opened up on Wall Street, which makes enslavement just a real presence in the heart of the in New York City. Um, and it brings more and more enslaved individuals into the North, where yes, that's not the final destination for where their labor is needed, but it is a real processing center, and there are a lot of enslaved individuals there. So by 1711, there is a lot of the slave trade going through New York. And in 1712, a slave revolt occurs in New York because of this large transitory enslaved population that's there. Um, there are about, numbers kind of vary, there's about 20 enslaved individuals that kickstart an uprising in an attempt to destabilize the society of New York and cause a bigger uprising. They want to initiate a large-scale insurrection of every enslaved individual in New York, whether they're there working, maybe as an artisan or at the docks, or if they're there as they're being processed, like they're there to be later sent down to the Carolinas. So in 1712, this group of about 20 enslaved individuals, they set fire to several buildings near Broadway and passed along the word that every enslaved individual rise up. They attacked every white New Yorker that they saw, end up killing about 8 of them with hatchets and swords. And the New York State militia comes in to put down the revolt, the 1712 revolt, and they're very unforgiving about this. They capture about 70 enslaved individuals, and out of those 70, about, I think, let's see, what are the numbers here? Over 20 of them are executed, as far as the records show, and they're executed pretty brutally. Some of them are burned to death, uh, and at least one individual who was seen as initiating this slave revolt is broken on the wheel, which is a very excruciating punishment. It's a very excruciating way to be executed. You're basically tied to a giant wagon wheel and you have all of your bones broken, and then you're just left there to die. So, the aftermath of the New York slave revolt was a very harsh crackdown on those who were felt to have perpetrated this. There's a I'm sorry, the quality is not well. A sketch of sort of this event where you see the buildings burning and people running around in the streets. So the result of the 1712 New York slave revolt, excuse me, was that almost everybody who is believed to have taken part in it was put on trial, even more people than were believed. I mean, over 70 people are arrested for this. That's not even as many as were thought to have um, initiated it. So there is a very harsh crackdown on those who were suspected of perpetrating it, and even those who were even slightly suspected of having any sympathy towards it. So there is a harsh reprisal for this revolt. And also in the aftermath of the 1712 New York slave revolt was even more restrictive laws put in place in order to curtail any slight possibility that enslaved individuals would be able to do this again. Some of the restrictive laws made it illegal for anybody of an African background to carry a gun or to have any sort of weapon or firearm on them, and they were not permitted to engage in risky activities as a group like gambling. There was a fear that people would get together and ostensibly be gambling, but they might actually be planning another insurrection or another violent revolt like the New York like this one in 1712. You'll see this a lot. I'm going to talk about it again in a minute about a couple other things, but there is a you can see a correlation throughout history of enslaved insurrection and rebellion, and then the aftermath is always a real crackdown on any rights or privileges that those enslaved individuals had once had. Usually you'll see it as a ban on weapons, a ban on um, a ban on sort of social uh, privileges like being able to marry, or legal privileges like testifying in court will be taken away in an attempt to prevent another attack from happening. That the idea is that if you take some sort of action to prevent their autonomy or prevent them from being able to access weapons or to gather as a group, that this will prevent another attack from occurring. Quiz question number 9. What was the result of the 1712 New York slave revolt? Some things that happened in the aftermath I'm looking for. In that same vein, there is, of course, we have that is a very considered a large slave revolt or slave insurrection in the North, is the 1712 one in New York. There is also one in the South, and one of the largest slave insurrections is known as the Stono Rebellion because it takes place near the Stono River in um, in South Carolina. So I want to talk about this too because we talked about one in the North. I think we should talk about one in the South because this is, of course, where people are also going to be more concerned about this because at a certain point there is going to be a very high enslaved population in the South where in some places there will be a an enslaved majority, where more of the population will be enslaved than free. So you have a higher black population than a white population, and that concern will often lead to more fear of rebellion and then therefore more restrictive laws to curtail behavior and activity with the hopes of preventing a rebellion or revolt. So the Stono Rebellion occurred in South Carolina, and it happened in September 1739. And what happened with the Stono Rebellion was there was a kind of a warehouse where there were about 20 African individuals, mostly young men, who were very recently enslaved. So they were enslaved in Africa. They were rumored to have been warriors in their home nations. And they were taken to the Carolinas, where they were in this warehouse and they were supposed to be then shipped out. They were going to be sold off and sent to various plantations to labor. Instead, they escape where they're the warehouse where they're being held, and they break into a weapons warehouse and gather together, hoping to march from that weapons warehouse in South Carolina down to Spanish Florida, where they will then be free. So these individuals were hoping to gather as many followers and supporters as possible while they made the march from South Carolina to Florida. They were um, they were reported to have tried to kill any white person that they came across and encouraged any enslaved individual that they came across to join them. There was about Eventually the group grows to about 100 individuals before they're caught by the local militia, and many of them are executed. Before I go too far into that, too, into the aftermath of the Stono Rebellion and what it was, the reason why these individuals wanted to go to Spanish Florida is because the Spanish were really trying to interrupt and disrupt the English economy, and they had said, "Hey, any slaves who make it down here, you will be freed." So they were trying to be a place that was encouraging rebellion and encouraging runaways because they wanted to cause trouble for English settlers. Spain and England didn't get along. I don't know if they do anymore. Um, but they don't get along, and they did not get along. And Spain was just hoping to um, encourage this enslaved population to escape south, where they would cause rebellions and insurrections like this and deprive the English of being able to use their labor. So, as I mentioned, the Stono Rebellion group swells to about 100 enslaved individuals. They're trying to make their way down to Spanish Florida. They're stopped by the local militia, and much like the New York Slave Rebellion or the New York Slave Revolt, the reprisal is swift and violent. Over 200 enslaved Africans are killed. Whether or not they were even part of the Stono Rebellion is irrelevant. The idea is to inflict terror in anybody who might have even thought of participating in this because they want to discourage it from happening again. Just like in New York, another result is that there was another round of very tight codes and laws passed to further restrict um, the actions and privileges that, as minor as they might have been, for the enslaved individuals of the Carolinas. There's also a law put in place that puts a little fine on anybody who imports slaves from Africa, with the idea being that they were trying to discourage a slave trade directly with Africa because they're thinking part of the reason why this rebellion went off is because the individuals taking part in it were strong young men who had a more martial background and who were more eager to get their freedom because they weren't as accustomed possibly to enslavement, that people coming directly from Africa were more volatile and dangerous and prone to trying to escape than maybe someone who was born into slavery. So we start to see with the Stono Rebellion a shift towards encouraging domestic growth of slavery, where there's a discouragement of importation of slave labor and an encouragement of domestic production, i.e., encourage people to have children to increase the enslaved population. Don't rely on importation from Africa because it will breed more danger. It is more unpredictable, um, and it will cause more issues and more attempts to escape and rebel, like in Stono. So, quiz question number 10. What was the Stono Rebellion and what was something that happened in the aftermath? So, just tell me a little bit about this. Okay, so this was again, I consider this a thematic lecture because it just kind of it goes through a longer frame of time than some of the other ones, and it touches on something that has been in place throughout several of the other topics we've discussed. Like talking about the Salem witch trials, slavery was in place. You talked about Tituba during that. So I wanted to make sure I gave this a good overview, despite the fact that it's not just one single chronological incident. It's something that goes throughout early American history, and it will come up time and time again and become especially pertinent as we get closer to the American Revolution in this class. And of course, it will come up again and come to the forefront when we start to get to the second half of this course and talk about the coming of the American Civil War, because the American Civil War has to be understood through the debate over slavery. I think this kind of explains why slavery was so important to the economy of the United States, and we'll talk more about some of those things when we get to some of our later lectures on this topic.